So thanks very much for that, Michael. So as he mentioned, my name is Gregory, and thanks very much for inviting me here to talk on behalf of North Glenora about how we got to NIMBY. I'm not sure if the resolution's good enough on this picture, but if you can see some of the faces, you might recognize a couple of people that are in the room. Ryan Young is the kind of guy in the middle with the blue shirt, and he's in the back there. He's going to talk on our panel. And Cam McDonald is here from Right at Home Housing Society as well. He's going to be on the panel as well. So one caveat before we begin. If you asked a dozen people involved with this engagement, they'd likely all have their own stories to tell about it. Les Young is sitting here. He was representing the church throughout, so he may or may not agree with things that come from the community's perspective, but I think that'll probably be instructive in the end. So I was a member and then chair of the planning committee for North Glenora during this engagement. This reflects my own experience leading this project, so these opinions are my own. And our objective with this presentation is to debrief the total experience and describe the engagement process that we ended up developing and then implementing along the way. Our hope is that it might serve as an example of effective community engagement for others to draw upon for similar developments here in Edmonton. I also think that the panel format that we're going to have later, with representatives from the church and the developer here alongside members of the community, also helps demonstrate how important and powerful empathy and shared understanding is in delivering the final product of a successful, well-integrated development. But first of all, I'll tell you how we ended up. So the official sod turning on Westmount Presbyterian Church, their new multifamily housing development, happened June 17th, 2016, 3 years to the day that the church first announced their plans to the Community League. Many of the church's neighbors, including myself and Ryan, were there to participate in the ceremony. And this was the symbolic moment signifying that North Glenora had said YIMBY to an affordable housing project that I'm convinced has a place in each and every one of our communities here in Edmonton. So when the church, a fixture of the community located directly across the street from our neighborhood school, announced its plans in summer 2013 to develop the land into a big, affordable housing project for newcomers, our sleepy, old community reacted as you might expect. You might remember that around that time, the Holy Trinity Anglican Church was clashing with the community of Terwilliger over a proposed 60-unit residence for the homeless. That plan was soon scrapped because the conversation broke down between the parties. And more than once, the words, "We don't want this to be another Terwilliger," were voiced in our meetings with the church and the Right at Home Housing Society. So to give you a bit of context, North Glenora is a very tight-knit, mature neighborhood where people watch each other's children, they volunteer for the Community League, and share news over the fence. In other words, we're no different than any of Edmonton's wonderful communities around the city. And in the early period after the announcement of this proposed development, fear of the unknown came to the surface. Concerns over increased density, impact on property values, and increases in crime were imagined, shared in the park, and then stoked through repetition over coffee. There goes the neighborhood. From this point, it took dozens of meetings and hundreds of hours of focused effort on both sides in order to get to YIMBY. So what follows in my presentation here is an attempt to summarize how we got there. While there are additional tools that we found and employed that we won't really have time to talk about here, I linked to them in a blog post that we can share with you later. I'll focus instead on what our overarching principles were and what we learned along the way, as this will be most useful as others attempt to replicate the success that we had. Let's see if this works. Doesn't want to work. Okay, perfect. So this is my motivational poster from most business walls. I didn't get credit, or I didn't pay for the use of any of these photographs, so please don't turn me in. So principle 1, establish shared objectives. In our first meeting with the church and Right at Home, we established together that our objective was to have a best-in-class, inclusive community engagement process in order to deliver the best possible outcome for all parties. We agreed that it would take time, but we hoped that the church would commit to listening to the community and incorporating their feedback into their design. I believe that everything good that followed hinged on this first understanding, and that enormous credit is due to the church and to Right at Home for having the courage to engage in this process with the community. Having this shared understanding in place up front gave us a foundation when discussions got heated or when shortcuts might have begun to look appealing. This is really important. It's far better to ask the developer up front if they intend to involve community feedback in a sincere way than to merely engage in dialogue until they meet the requirements of their development application and just do what they intended to do from the beginning. So I'm not sure if you can read this, but as an example, this is a quick look at what a typical engagement continuum looks like. So it proceeds on the left from inform, where the developer simply commits to keeping you up to speed, and it proceeds along the right to sort of involve and collaborate as the third or fourth phases or stages potentially of community engagement. And this is where we strove to be in North Glenora, where the developer consults the community for regular feedback in order to include the community in its decision making. So principle 2, openness. Very soon after the church announced their plan, the NGCL executive met, and we agreed that the planning committee would represent the community in communications with the developer. So we had an official mandate. We then met as a committee to discuss what we wanted to achieve and set our first meeting with the church as soon as possible. So in that first meeting, we came prepared to listen with an exhaustive list of preliminary questions that we felt would allow us to report the initial development plan knowledgeably to the community. Questions included, what is your plan for the site? What kind of variances will you look for? When do you hope to submit the development plan? When do you hope to break ground? And can you provide a preliminary timeline for the project? So, it may sound kind of stupid or easy, but it's amazing what you can learn when you ask questions and are prepared to listen. We also committed to regular, open communication in order to establish and maintain mutual understanding among all the parties. Out of this came a rough timeline for the engagement, including different milestones for communicating progress and direct community feedback into the process. It seems that the Achilles heel of many redevelopment plans in the city is that too many decisions are made too early without involving the community, committing the developer to a plan before engagement has taken place, and derailing authentic dialogue before it can truly happen. So a great question that you can ask, you'll probably recognize the fact that I'm speaking on behalf of the community in all this because that's our perspective. But a great question you can ask in this first meeting is, are you willing to listen to community input and feedback on the plan and incorporate it into your design within reason? If the developer is unable to say yes with sincerity to this question, then you don't really have an authentic community engagement ahead of you. And if this is the case, you might even consider withdrawing as a committee from the process. You don't want to find yourself unwittingly co-opted into an inauthentic engagement process on behalf of the neighborhood. Because the risk as neighbors and members of the community is that you can be seen by your neighbors as being complicit in a plan that you really have no control over at the end of the day. Principle 3, transparency. As a committee, we would get together regularly to prepare our approach to each meeting, and we selected a spokesperson who'd be responsible for driving each agenda. With several parties at the table and so many potentially competing agendas, this is important in order to ensure you achieve the outcome that everyone needs from each meeting. It's critical that this person is experienced in running an effective meeting, or you'll likely end up frustrated and the conversation will fail. The stakes here are extremely high. We took careful notes of everything that was said and agreed to in the meetings, and we followed up by sending detailed minutes to all participants so that they could review them, make any comments or changes, and then approve. Once approved, these minutes were then published to the North Glenora website for public viewing and posterity. I haven't checked recently, and this was several years ago, but I imagine you can probably go in and still see those minutes. We updated the NGCL executive and solicited feedback when necessary to ensure that we remained on the right track, and provided regular progress updates to our community email list and in our monthly paper newsletter. Does anyone else have a paper newsletter still? We've got a few? Okay. Yeah, we're still publishing that in North Glenora. Each of these updates ended with, if you have any questions or comments, please contact us at ngcl.plan@gmail.com. In this way, we behaved like a professional board of directors in this community engagement, and with good reason. In an environment where our emotions were high and opinions were strongly held, we wanted to ensure that the committee wouldn't be seen as having a secret agenda in the discussions with the developer. We made public everything we learned or did as it happened for review and comment by the community. This is another great way to maintain your mandate and preserve the trust and engagement level of the community. Principle 4, neutrality, diversity, and inclusion. Another core principle that served us was that we would only speak on behalf of what we believed to be in the best interest of the community at large. That our own individual concerns as committee members were valid only as single voices within this course. And in order to speak confidently on behalf of the community, we adopted the North Glenora Community Development Plan. This was a community development plan that was created with the community and published by our committee back in 1998. We used this as sort of a constitution for the decisions that we'd be making as a committee. And Right at Home Housing Society agreed to do the same. And at regular intervals, we solicited direct feedback on specific issues through online and paper surveys that we delivered door to door to the whole neighborhood. We condensed all of the qualitative and quantitative feedback and provided it to the church and Right at Home with as little editing as possible. And finally, we were sure to schedule periodic face-to-face town hall meetings where individuals could hear for themselves how the plan was progressing. Armed with these three tools, our development plan, direct feedback surveys, and face-to-face town hall meetings, we felt confident we were representing the community's interest to a reasonable standard. So one of the strengths of our committee as well was that from the beginning, it contained a diversity of voices from around the community. Neutral, supportive, and opposed. We also benefited from a strong network of non-community elders that we would bounce ideas off informally to test our assumptions about whether we were on the right track. We reminded ourselves often that every resident should be encouraged to participate in the process at every stage, that all opinions were valid and welcome, no matter how extreme or as yet uninformed. Anyone that wanted to could join the committee and get involved at any time. We acknowledged that we were dealing with a planned development that would affect homes that in some cases had been in families for 2 generations. So everyone had to have a right to be heard. Principle 5, courage. So this is the tough one. Many of us might wish to go comfortably about our days without having to have difficult conversations about affordable housing in our neighborhood, let alone to be suddenly responsible for representing your community's diverse and often incendiary opinions on the matter. As committee members, that's basically what we had to do. So to address the fear of affordable housing, we decided to take it head on in as emotionless a way as possible. We realized that these concerns were valid and that the community deserved the right to ask pointed questions and to hear what the developers' answers and motivations were. So we went about finding a series of canned questions that are published online from a similar development. I think it was somewhere in the US. And then customized the list by informally polling our neighbors and the NGCL board in order to get an exhaustive set of questions and concerns about the impact of this potential development, really before we knew almost anything about it. And we then boiled these down to 13 big questions. So to give you an idea, 2 of the more controversial questions were, the injection of low-income housing into a community can increase crime under some conditions. Have you given thought to this? And can you provide research and evidence that supports why the proposed development will not have this effect in North Glenora. The injection of low-income housing into a community can reduce property values under some conditions. Have you given thought to this, and can you provide research and evidence that supports why the proposed development will not have this effect in North Glenora? So as you can imagine, some understandable outrage was felt and expressed by the church. I can still remember like it was yesterday getting the withering, "How dare you, sir?" look from Les Young, who was sitting across the table from us as we were presenting these questions. And the thing was, we could totally sympathize with how they were feeling. The implication that the church's inspiring vision of providing affordable housing for new Canadians might result in crime or lowered property values was understandably taken as an insult. And that said, I believe strongly we had to put each other through this uncomfortable exercise so as not to let these concerns be swept under the rug where they might fester. So the church and Right at Home Housing Society, to their credit, accepted this list from us and took due time to answer each one in full in writing, doing quite extensive research at the same time. And then this document was then presented to the committee for our review, so we understood what their opinions were, before we then shared it with the community and posted it to our website for everyone's reference. Like it or not, our role as members of the committee was to play the devil's advocate, which you can imagine might be a little uncomfortable when you're meeting in a church. We felt we had to press the church to answer these concerns in as complete and clear a way as possible, in order that the neighborhood can then feel it was making an informed decision on the proposal, free of as much fear and uncertainty as possible. So, principle 6, respect. At the end of the day, the property owner is the property owner. We respected the church's right to execute their vision for the property, while asserting our rights as neighbors to be consulted on something that would directly affect us. Our assertion from the beginning was that by involving us in the process, they stood to gain not only our support as a community, but also a better final design to serve their vision, one that would be welcomed and embraced by the neighborhood. Principle 7, leaps of faith. So in retrospect, important leaps of faith were required by both parties. We were asking the church and their partners to take a leap up front to involve the community in their plans. So this involves significant risk, including the potential for costly delays, confrontation, and expenditure of hundreds of man-hours of effort without a certain outcome. And once the engagement was complete and the development plan was submitted, North Glenora had to take a leap, principally to trust that the developer would deliver on all of the promises that they had made to us at the time of the development permit. So there was real tension here. You have to remember that North Glenora's planning committee is made up of volunteers. Volunteers like you with busy lives, schedules to keep, and kids to get to and from soccer and hockey. And the church had a vision that they wanted to bring to fruition. And in a very real way, we were standing in the way of it. Despite this potential for conflict, I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish together. So our committee felt that its job was to ensure that a robust engagement process was conducted, and that the community would have a chance to be heard, and that the developer would be encouraged to incorporate our feedback into the design. So once we'd accomplished that, it was going to be out of our hands. The responsibility would rest with individual neighbors to exercise their rights and attend the hearing at City Hall to speak for or against the development in an informed way. So here we go, the fruits of our labor. This is actually taken as a picture of the design that was submitted at around the time that we did our final town hall meeting. But it looks almost exactly like the actual building that stands today. On September 28, 2015, the church invited the community to one last open house to hear the final development plans for the site. Like all previous meetings, this one was very well attended and was conducted in an atmosphere of interest and general support. Peter Amarongan from Habitat Studio described all the different ways that resident input had been incorporated into the materials and design of the building. He shared that it will be Canada's first multifamily net zero emissions housing project. Cam McDonald of Right at Home Housing Society shared that they were pursuing a mixed income, affordable housing model for large families, and described how the new drive aisle had been redesigned in order to address the safety concerns expressed by the community. They both went on to answer every question raised by the community, so they were very generous with their time. We had a packed house at the church. They were well prepared, and I think confident that having put in the work of listening, they understood in advance what the perspectives of those asking these questions were. So perhaps most importantly, they ended by saying if there was ever any unanticipated issue that needed to be addressed, that they would commit to taking it head on in consultation with their neighbors. And isn't this all you can expect from a good neighbor? So less than a month later, on October 19th, 2015, the public hearing for the development application was at City Hall. 2 residents stood up to speak in favor of the development. None were opposed. The mayor congratulated the developers in North Glenora on a successful community engagement. At the sod turning ceremony, Ryan, as our community league president and all-around good neighbor, was there to hand a homemade apple pie to Cam. Members of the church team and we on the committee kind of had an opportunity to connect as well, and we agreed that while our shared understanding was hard fought, things that are worthwhile are rarely easy. So in terms of a timeline, my earliest notes of the planning committee engaging with the church came from around June of 2013. And as I mentioned, the development plan was proposed successfully to the city in October of 2015, and the groundbreaking occurred in June of 2016. Families moved in the fall of 2017 in time to start the school year at Coronation. So clearly, all developments won't have the luxury of 2 years in consultation. But having been through it, I believe that 6 months can be long enough to complete a thorough community engagement once the parties have agreed to engage, have established common goals, and have demonstrated a commitment to the process. So in the final analysis, our objective of delivering a robust, sincere community engagement was met. We were successful because diverse groups were involved, and we checked in regularly to confirm that we're still on the right track. You'll have to bear this in mind when you're planning your own community engagements, whether as a developer or as a representative of the community. So finally, some important acknowledgements. This is included in the blog, so if you can't read it, that's okay. I've necessarily kept this talk as brief as possible, but I wanted to make sure that it was clear that a successful engagement can't be achieved without the openness and generosity of a great number of people, and I've listed some of them here. Thanks very much.
Is this one working? Oh, here we go. Perfect. Andrew has agreed to take a few questions.
Sure.
We have maybe 8 minutes or so. So is there anybody who has a question about, and so remember in this we're talking about process, we're not talking about the project itself. So Andrew's not going to be able to talk about net zero housing and persnickety details about that. But
I'm just wondering who initiated the formation of the planning committee, whether that came at the request of the church and developer, or whether the community league initiated saying we want a voice at the table as this project moves forward.
So very much like a lot of community leagues, we, despite the fact that we're a small community, we have a very active community league, and so we had an established planning committee, which is principally involved with going to pub nights once a month. And then in the span of a few months, we had the proposed affordable housing project, and then another one in the community by the Métis Capital Housing Corporation. So really it was just people that were already in place. And then a great number of single issue residents who woke up and said, hey, I want to be on this committee if it's going to affect my house.
In terms of the planning committee's involvement with this particular project,
Yeah.
who sort of initiated that level of engagement and participation?
Well, I mean, it was sort of by default this committee's issue, and so when the community league executive got together, right, it was proposed, or in fact, I think how it was started was that Annabelle, the pastor of the church, actually came to an executive meeting to say, here's what we're planning. And it was the subsequent meeting where the executive said, okay, planning committee, what are we going to do about this? And that's when we initiated that process. I think the community league executive knew that we were going to need a community engagement. I think there was quite a bit of concern about the project to begin with, and so the planning committee was the one that was sort of pointed out to do the thing.
Hi, thanks for that presentation, that was awesome. I'm not sure if this is a too detailed question, but could you talk a little bit about how the developer demonstrated that they use the community's input in the design?
Great point. So I think that we got a commitment early on from Right at Home that they were willing to engage at this level, right? And principally what we were hoping to do was to involve community feedback into the design, right? So that was really the mandate of this whole thing. And as a result, the questions that we asked of the community were specifically, what are your opinions of it? You know, what are your opinions around materials and design? What are your opinions around the way it looks? What are your opinions around questions that you'd like to ask about its eventual impact? So we presented the answers to those questions to the church and to Right at Home Housing Society. And they made a point of coming back to us to say, we heard you. This is what we're doing as a result. And that would have been content for those updates that we were providing to the community. So we would say, one of the failures of 90% of feedback surveys is that you never hear what happened with the feedback. So we did a really good job of saying, okay, so you send out the survey, you get the answers back. We tell people, here are all the responses. So see what the qualitative and quantitative response was. And then paired with that was, here is the response from the developer. And so that's I think, how we were able to maintain that mandate to say, you're just not asking us questions and forgetting about it, you're showing me the response of Right at Home.
Did they demonstrate how it was in the design at that session? You said that.
Yeah, they pointed to different things that were, when they were showing early, the sort of mock-ups or the designs migrated over the period. And so when we were holding face-to-face town hall meetings, Peter and Cam would make an effort to say, we heard from the community that you're concerned about parking. So here's what we're doing about parking. We heard from the community that you're concerned about how this will look in the front. So here's an image of how it's going to look. We heard from the people behind the place that you're worried about the fact that your front yard is now going to be in shadow all day. And so they actually showed us this series of photos for different seasons of the year about what the actual shadow of this development would be. So that's how they did it.
I wasn't sure I completely heard the composition of the planning committee. Did it include people who expressed that they were sort of opposed to this, or was it?
Yeah, it did. So in particular, a woman named Joanne she was in the neighborhood nearby, and her opinion coming in was that this was going to be a problem. Really, anybody who came in had the chance to be on the committee. We found that the people that were most opposed kind of failed to engage. So we did have a resident who was behind the unit who very vocally was saying, there goes the neighborhood, I'm selling my property, and you should too, and then went ahead and sold her property. So that was sort of that was her last engagement with the process.
Thanks very much for this presentation and all the work you did. I have two unrelated questions. The first one is, did I understand correctly that when this came to City Council for a public hearing, the committee did not speak? The committee only encouraged, residents of North Glenora to speak? That's my one question. And the other one is, who delivered all the paper surveys? Like how many people were working on this, and how did you find all those people to do all that work?
We used child labor. Yes, it was me and Ryan and our kids and everyone else's kids, and yeah, we sort of made it into a fun thing. The first question was, did the committee go and speak? So, again, I was chair at the time, and I actually made a point through this whole process of not sharing my opinion. I sort of felt like, because I was on the committee, I didn't get a chance to, I shouldn't share my opinion. I kind of kept it to myself because I thought that it had to be separate from that whole proceeding anyway. And then when, so I mentioned the two people spoke. One of them was the president of the community league and the other one was the chair of the planning committee. But we were there as individuals. So we weren't speaking on behalf of the committee at that point, and we weren't speaking on behalf of the community. We were speaking on behalf of two people that had watched this process and then were there to support it as individuals. Because the other thing is, at that point, you're talking in front of the mayor. So, we certainly couldn't be seen to be saying, in our official capacity, we're in support of this development. We could have, and maybe, who knows? I decided that we shouldn't. Yeah, I decided that we shouldn't.
We're going to take one more question for Andrew, and then after that we're going to transition to a panel. So we'll have more questions for the panel very shortly.
One of the things you mentioned were just participation levels and the opportunity for everybody in the community to be able to participate. Can you just give us a sense of how many people actually came out and got involved in both the committee but also in the surveys that you put out in the community?
Yeah, I've through work I've been involved in things like surveys and other things like that. And while I can't tell you exact numbers, I can tell you that in every case I was surprised to the point of maybe 50% oversubscription for the whole process, whether that was an online survey, a printed survey, or the town hall meetings. We just didn't have empty meetings. And maybe part of that is that we're one of those communities that's set up with all of our front doors facing the park, and many of them facing the church. People feel like they're in a community, and so they're much more connected to one another. And so it's much easier for people to say, hey, did you fill out that survey?
So were they like 10 to 15, or were you having like hundreds of people?
10 to 15, yeah, like 100 surveys. I'm not sure, Cam, can you say how many people would have come to your average town hall meeting? Well over 100. Yeah, so, that would have sucked if we had gone through all that work and ended up talking to ourselves about the whole thing. But we felt like we were able to involve the whole community.
Very good. Thank you so much.